And can you see? Can you see
might
just the
just flip.
presentation?
Yeah, I'll just flip your screen really quick, Jim.
Yep.
Like we walked through earlier. That
Yeah,
display settings tab. Just flip your screen and.
It's funny that display setting went away. Of course. Here we go. Let's see, where is that?
Jim, if you need me to, I can
you might
grab it really quick.
Yeah,
you
might have
go
to.
ahead and
it's for some reason. Yeah, I know exactly the swap screen, but it's not in
All right. Give me just a moment and I will bring that up for you here really quick.
Thanks. Weird. Here we go.
You got it, or you want me to go ahead and start sharing for you?
Yeah, you know what? I think I can do it this. Let me see if I can do it this way.
Okay.
All right. Now, if I could do my share screen, there we go. See if this works. Is that it?
Here you go.
All right.
We're good now.
Cool. Very good. All right. So one of the things that I've noticed that both experts in the field as well as lay people sometimes get the risk wrong, and as professionals whose job is to try to get the risk right, I thought I would present to you some of the challenges that we face in getting the risk right. And some of these are related to cognitive biases. Some of them are related to the information that we get. Some of them are related to mathematical issues that occur. And I'm going to give you kind of a sampling of each one of these, and at the end kind of try to tie it all together and just get us to start thinking about, well, why and how we might get the risk wrong. So here is an example of maybe the experts getting the risk wrong potentially. What we have here is the global risk landscape, which is published each year by the World Economic Forum. This is industry experts, risk experts from around the world. And they, in 2020, just 1 year ago, have placed infectious disease over here. Now, the way this matrix works is they have on this axis, you have the severity or the impact, and on this one, the likelihood. So they put it up fairly high into this quadrant of having a big impact, but not very likely. Of course, we see 1 year later, and it's over here, it's actually moved up in terms of severity and likelihood. So did the experts get the risk wrong? Are they currently getting the risk wrong? And did they have it right the first time? So there's a few things that could be going on here. One is that the risk actually does belong over here, and that we have maybe a recency bias that has affected their decision on putting this over into something more likelihood and a higher likelihood, and maybe it'll be another 100 years before we have a pandemic again. Or it could be that they've learned more information and this is actually where it belongs. Or it could be that there was an optimism bias back here, and the optimism bias actually prevented them from putting it into the category that they have currently in. So I'll have to see if there is probably a combination of a few things. Maybe they do have more information about pandemics than they had before. But it could be that there's an optimism bias or a recency bias. We'll see over the next, I'll say 5 to 10 years, where this ends up, on the World Economic Forum's risk matrix. So one of here's some fun facts. There's all the ways you can die. But the reason I present this is I wonder if you would have ranked these the way that they actually are in terms of your odds of dying. And I've kind of got these categorized. You can look over here. The top categories here are, I guess we would call more natural deaths, cancer, heart disease, respiratory illnesses. And these would be more in the accidental types of entry. So would you have guessed, this if I had just put this list together? Would you have ranked them in this order? And if not, and if you would have put something in higher odds, you have to think about, well, why? Why would I have put one of these over here much higher, or one of these lower than what the actual risk is? Well, there could be optimism bias and things like that are going into it. But I'd like for you to think about how it is that we receive information, and this is our first bias that we might want to think about is we assess risk based on the information that we have, right? And where do we get the information from? Well, it comes from our friends, our families, but also certainly from media. Well, on the far left side here, you've got the actual causes of death and the percentage. So heart disease is a big thing, right? And we saw that earlier. It's one of the highest likelihoods of causing death. Cancer certainly is in there. And these are the actual causes. Now, when we look at Google searches, which would kind of be an indicator of what people are actually thinking about as in their risk, heart disease doesn't really come up at all. Very, very seldom. Cancer certainly does. People think about cancer and Google cancer a lot. Diabetes actually comes up fairly high in Google searches, as well as suicide. Terrorism more than what you would find in the actual causes of death. So if you go back, remind ourselves here, terrorism is 1 in 166 and 619. So it's much higher in terms of Google searches. If we move further to the right here, and you look at a couple of well-known news outlets, the New York Times and the UK Guardian, look at where they present these various, how much coverage they give to these different categories. And look how much terrorism is. So you would think that terrorism, if just based on coverage, is a big risk that is facing, the world. And as we saw that, that likelihood of you being killed in a terrorist attack is very low. Same with homicide. And homicide is, a risk, but it's certainly much, much greater than the actual likelihood. And suicide and cancer and others. Heart disease, again, is not really very well promoted. And so you think about, okay, what is their motivation? And I don't think I'm a skeptical person, but I don't believe that the media is trying to mislead us on anything. I think that they know what sells. They know what gets attention, and they know what gets people to look, which translates to ad dollars. So you always have to think about that with the coverage you get from the media. I think people are suspicious that they're trying to fool us about something. I think it's less of that and more about what sells, okay, and what's going to get, eyeballs, on there. And so terrorism and homicide and suicide definitely gets people's attention, and and then helps to promote advertisements. So that's kind of the reality of this, and we just need to understand that that's what's going on. But then we have to ask ourselves the question, well, why is it that they would pick terrorism? What is it about terrorism or homicides that they would use those, and why would those draw more eyeballs and to their information than heart disease, which has much more likelihood of people dying from? So one of the things is something called dread. So here's an example, and this was in USA Today. 2020 was an unusually deadly year for shark attacks. And we were talking earlier about, well, we can't wait to go on vacations again. Well, should I, go on that, vacation, and should I get in the water? I mean, my gosh, if we've got an unusually deadly year, of shark attacks. And, then you look at, hold on a second, in absolute terms, here's the unprovoked shark attack. And by the way, if you want to know what a provoked shark attack, you can just Google it on YouTube, and you can find all kinds of people who are provoking sharks for whatever reason. But these are unprovoked, and it's actually declining. And we're talking about less than 20. So what does that mean in terms of odds? Here's the United States, here's Australia. Fatal shark attacks were 3 in 2020, but they're up. They were up from previous years by 1. So in the United States, even considering only the people that are going to the beaches, so you're at the beach, should you get in the water, your chance is 1 in 11.5 million. Okay. Now, if you just take, the people in general, obviously, people that don't go to the beach, the odds are even much higher. So why the focus? Honestly, should we even have, that? And the answer is probably not. There's probably no reason to even have that as a report, but there's you can go find shark attack, websites and all kinds of things. But is it something that we really should fear? And why is it that we fear that? And it's the same, with terrorist attack. There's something about that we find particularly dreadful, and that in the truest pure sense of the word, it inspires dread in us. It scares us in a way that other things like heart disease or even cancer does not. And there's some research on why that is. For most of human civilization, we've lived in small communities. It's really only, honestly, in the last few hundred years where we're living in communities where we can find out about information that is taking place in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, that are, potentially a risk to us. So for most of human civilization, if somebody told you, that about a risk, whether it was, a shark attack, or a saber-toothed tiger attack, whatever, it may have been, in our human development, you not only had something to fear from the severity of it, but probably from the likelihood, because somebody telling you about it was not, a news outlet that's thousands of miles away. It was somebody very close. And so for almost all of human civilization, except for the last, maybe century, that information, the severity was closely tied to likelihood, and so it's kind of hardwired into us that something very dreadful is also something very likely. Now, that's not necessarily true. In fact, it's not true at all now. But we can learn about dreadful things that are not within our own sphere. But we still are hardwired to associate dread and likelihood. So dread in our minds actually impacts our perception of the likelihood of that risk occurring. Another thing that frightens us is when we lose control or when things happen that we don't quite understand. So first of all, in the United States, with manually driven vehicles, we have about 32,000 people that die a year. And we have 41% of people saying, they didn't want to share the road with driverless cars, which ostensibly, and I think so far, have proven to be much safer than that. And 78% of respondents said they were afraid to ride in an autonomous vehicle, and that's just a few years ago. And you've probably seen if Tesla or something gets into an accident, oh my God, they pull them all off the road, right? And they say, okay, there's something wrong with these vehicles. We just can't trust them. And one of the things is control. When we give up control, we perceive something to be more risky. Now, one of the things is kind of clever that was done by one of the auto manufacturers is they gave the vehicles a voice, and you can pick the voice of somebody. And afterwards, people said they trusted the autonomous vehicle that they weren't driving at all. They're not even involved with. Some of them don't even have steering wheels. And they said they trusted it more if it was talking to them. And some of the respondents even said, well, I think it was trying its best, And one of the Stanford researchers said, if you think the car likes you, you think it's going to try harder to do well for you. And that's terribly worrisome. That because obviously whatever that risk is of the autonomous vehicle has nothing to do with whether it's programmed to talk to you or not. But the perception of that risk does change. So, but think about this, and I think that one of the reasons I think we're going to start to see this, especially with commercial vehicles, is somebody's going to say, look, we have all these accidents, and we can now reduce the likelihood of them occurring through autonomous driverless vehicles. I think it's probably less likely that it's really going to take off in the passenger world. If you look at these numbers, people don't trust it, they don't want it, but it will in the commercial space, and then maybe that will start, so the fleet vehicles will become more likely to be the ones. Plus, you've got, they're more expensive vehicles anyway, and adding the autonomous features as a percentage of the cost of that vehicle is more economically feasible. So anyway, I think that's where we're going to see, but part of it is because of the perception of risk. So here's a question. I wish I had we could poll on this one. Is violent crime going up or down? Now, the first question you should ask me is, okay, well, over what time period, Jim? Is it are we talking about the last year, the last 2 years? Or are you talking about the last, 30 years? And, and I'll say, okay, well, let's think about the past year. We'll say the last, 30 years. What do you think? Or last 40 years? Is it going up or down? Well, the answer is, if you're looking at it in 2020, rates did go up. So if you were looking at that time period, yeah, it went up. But if you look at it over a longer time period, it's come down fairly dramatically. And is that something that you would have guessed? If I had asked you, what do you think, the crime rate has been since, 1992, is it about the same, less or more? Would you have said it's dramatically less? Probably not, I suspect. And again, think back on the news coverage and how much of the news coverage is devoted to homicide. So the information that we're getting, it certainly would not support that. In fact, here is information on surveys of, share of respondents who believe that the U.S. crime rate has increased over this time period. And, it's a number of people believe that it has, but here's the actual, crime rates, whether it's property crime or violent crime over that time period, the same time period. So the perception of that risk was actually much different than the actual risk. And again, part of this is the issue of dread, and fear. And certainly violent crimes is something that fear is. So again, we tend to associate something that's dreadful as likely. It's just kind of the way we're wired, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, and it's not just the news media that is out there trying to get eyeballs. We also have politicians who honestly, the way they get funding, the way they get votes is to get people eyeballs on them. And Twitter is a fairly recent way that's occurred. So here was a congresswoman who says, oh my gosh, we had 365,348 children went missing in 2020. And that's actually a true statistic, by the way. But what does going missing? And what's interesting, it was 75,000 less than the previous year. But you haven't heard about it in the media, and therein lies the problem. So if I have my students on, it should be therein lies the problem. Don't write it like that. But what is going on here? Because here is information from the missing and exploited children, who, by the way, have no reason to understate the count, have it at, for the same time period, 27,000. So what's going on, with this? Well, it turns out missing, you can be missing, and this is not a reported missing in the 365,000. That's an estimated amount of children who go missing from their caretakers or from their parents for an hour or more. So, and I've had this, with my own son is, he was supposed to be in chess club and he was somewhere else and he was missing. And that was terrifying for that hour. And that's what that's talking about. What's reported is if it's over 24 hours. Okay, so if if your kid stays over in choir practice and you didn't know about it, or if you're, if they took the bus home to their friend's house to play basketball, whatever, that's reported. That's part of the estimate of missing, because and you can't get a hold of them by the phone, they're missing. But if you're talking about those reported, it's been over 24 hours, it goes from 365,000 now to like 27,000. Okay, so here's a way of maybe not understanding what goes into those numbers and maybe why we need to kind of drill into that. We don't have time sometimes, so we kind of have to rely on other people. But I think my point on this is there are reasons why people want to get your attention. And, I think news media and politicians want to get your attention. And so anything that I'm not saying you have to distrust them, and I think that's even a bad thing. But having a healthy sense of skepticism is a good thing about this. If you're getting information from media or politicians, because they have an interest in getting your attention. What's interesting also about the missing children, this is actually missing, exploited, runaways, the whole thing. That of the 27 of these that go missing, most of these, now when you think about missing, is like, oh my God, somebody's taking these kids, and if it really were 365,000 kids being abducted by strangers, then that would be an issue. And by the way, I think when you hear these things, one thing, if you don't have to go through in this analysis of going and finding the data, you can say, look, if there were 365,000 children missing, would the tens of thousands of journalists out there of all political stripes and all competing with each other and all trying to get your attention, would they all conspire to not tell you about it? If you believe that they would, I think that's another risk, but I'm not going to cover it today. But I think you can use critical thinking to say, hold it, why? I don't believe that in a competitive environment that would actually occur. Now, when you get to this and you actually look at the actual numbers, there is abductions. Where do most of the abductions come from? Family abductions is actually part of it. But the dread piece, and I think having a family abduction and usually the non-custodial parent taking them is certainly dreadful. But I think the really dreadful thing that we think about, and honestly, I think that has changed our society from the way that I grew up, which was, we would run, around the streets, and my parents would tell me, go out and play, and you'll see at dinner time, and or on the weekends, go out and play. I'll see you at lunch or whatever, and you ran all over the neighborhood. And you go, you did things, and that's not the way. And in fact, it would, you might even be considered irresponsible today if you were to do that. And I think part of it is our fear of stranger abductions. But here's looking at then according to the missing exploited children, who by the way get their money from telling you about how many missing exploited children are. But I think their numbers are accurate. But I'm just saying they don't have any reason to understate their numbers. Have it at 79 a year, and the U.S. Department of Justice and Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency says that number is actually so low and so rare as to be unreliable. And if you look at the report, it's probably less because some of that 79 turns out to be abducted by family members. So stranger abductions, now you're getting into shark attack territory in terms of the odds. But my guess is most of us would not have surmised that as the actual risk, and maybe don't even want to admit that. And so that's but is that when we've changed society pretty dramatically, because of that stranger abduction risk, is that okay? And if we went back to the way things were, when I grew up and children ran free in the neighborhoods, and that number went up to 790, would we be okay with that? And I think most people, that I know would say, well, of course not. That would be totally unacceptable. And if I ask, Well, why? Well, because you can't have that dreadful kind of thing happening to children. And I agree. I understand. How many children die in auto accidents every year? Here in the United States, it's over 1,000. How many children die in gun accidents in the United States here every year? And it's over 3,200,000. 3,200 is how many. It's about 9 per day. So you've got that risk that we accept, but we don't accept the risk of stranger abduction, kidnappings. We've changed our whole society to kind of prevent that from occurring. Is it because we got the risk wrong? And I don't know if it is, or if it's just because that is such a dreadful risk that we want to completely reduce that. But something to think about. Okay, yeah, less than 1%. All right, here's kind of a mathematical. The next ones are, something's related to Simpson's Paradox, where we aggregate different groups. And if you think of this, Simpson's Paradox is we've got apples and oranges all in the same basket, and we're measuring them, and we're not separating out, and we're not comparing the apples within the two groups to the apples in the two groups. We're comparing the whole thing. So let me give you an example here. So this is the actual admissions and the percentage by men and women at Berkeley. And would you say from this, would you draw the conclusion that Berkeley is discriminating against women? And you may say, oh yeah, that's I think that's exactly what they're doing here. And if you want to, if you're doing a screenshot right now, and you can't wait to send this off to people to show them the hypocrisy of Berkeley, you have to think about something, that why are you wanting to do that, and are you contributing to another problem we have with risk, is something called the social amplification of risk. So taking information and amplifying it through social media. Well, before you do that, as much as you may want to, you might want to take a look at this. This is the way Berkeley sets theirs up. You don't just apply to the university as a whole, you apply to departments. And if you start to look at the applicants and the admission rates, in many of the cases, in fact, the majority of the cases, women are admitted at a higher rate than men are in that department. Okay, there are a couple here that men are a couple departments where the men are admitted at higher, but in general, the women are admitted at higher rates for these different departments. Well, so how on earth do you end up with this? Well, the reason being, and this is part of the Simpson's Paradox, is the women applied to the departments that had a more selective, this is the percent, they were very selective in these areas. So only 33% of men got it, only 35% of women, compared to if the women had been applying to Department A, then that would have changed the aggregate. So what you have to be able to do is start to compare within these groups, apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And so, and I think the reason I've highlighted the number here, you have to look at the N for each. And when you see these big disparities in the N, start to think about it. But this is something that trips up not just lay people, but I see research presentations on this, and think about it, if you didn't have the departmental breakdown like we do, if you didn't happen to have that data, you might draw that conclusion. And I see, this happening a lot. Here's another one. Oops. Okay. The vaccinated are dying at higher rates. And this is not fake data. This is true data. This is actual data from the CDC. Okay. And it was as of November, so it was last year. But should this give you pause about getting vaccinated? If they're dying, if they're dying. So let me tell you, remember, when you got the comparison of you got apples and oranges, all and pears and peaches all in the same basket. If you don't have the same number of apples within the basket and the same number of oranges, you end up with different, you can't aggregate them very well. Well, look at what you're aggregating here. You're aggregating age between 10 and 59. Okay, so what's the likelihood of a 10-year-old dying and a likelihood of a 59-year-old dying? So let's just say, just make it very simple. If one group was all 10-year-olds, and they'll say an unvaccinated, and all the vaccinated were 59-year-olds, then that would explain it, right? Well, do you think that the distribution of vaccinated and unvaccinated are the same? That there's exactly the same percentage? Well, it turns out that's not true. So even if we just take the very broad bands like 10 to 29 and 30 to 59, what we find is that death rates per 1,000 are twice as high over here for unvaccinated as well as vaccinated. But then you end up, when you compare them, as as much more. And so why is that? Well, because you look at the number of people that you've got in this group here, compared to this group. Okay. So you would expect that to occur. So this is swamping your results, the people here and the people here. Okay. All right. So here's another one. This was probably, I think it's a little easy to figure. What's going on in Israel? You hear about COVID in Israel and vaccinations in Israel. Well, it turns out that severe cases of COVID in Israel are actually higher among the vaccinated than the non-vaccinated. The number, this is absolute, this isn't a rate, so that should be a clue right there, right? This is the absolute number of severe cases. So what do you think's missing, from that? You probably ought to get this one, just with a little critical thinking. So yeah, a lot more people are vaccinated, than people who are not vaccinated. So the fact that you have, in absolute terms, more people who are catching COVID, even if it's severe, may not surprise you. Here's probably something you'd want to see is, okay, I want to see the actual rate per 100,000. And you say, oh, okay, the actual risk reduction on COVID cases is much higher. And if you look at people over the age of 50, it goes up as high as 85% risk reduction. So that's, part of it, you have to think about, but when you're looking at these numbers, think about who's in that group and what is the distribution of the people. So, all right. So those kind of the mathematical ones for those in the crowd. I think we have some actuarial students that were with us today, and they might like that. Here is perceptions of risk and how that affects the vaccination rates. And I've actually got some research that a colleague and I are doing this on this similar, just within the United States and looking at various states. But your perception of risk depends on your worldview when it comes to COVID. So if you have, there's a worldview that's called individual worldview, which says, I believe the government interferes too much in our everyday lives. they're going to have a different, wider perspective on COVID, as do people who have what's called pro-sociality view. Is to what extent do you think it's important to do things that benefit others in society? So if you hold either of those views, it's going to affect your perception of COVID and vaccinations. Another big one is your direct experience. Do you have you had experience? Have you had it yourself or a close family member? If that's true, that's going to affect your perception of risk. And there's other things that trust in science and there's this issue of social amplification, social media, and how much you participate in that. But it varies by country, and I will tell you it varies by state. I don't think I have it on the slide, but the research that we're looking at that we've done, there's something called tightness and looseness of cultures. And if anybody's grown up in a small town versus a big city, and I've grown up in both. I've spent a good chunk of my life in small towns, people of 1,000 people, and I've lived in cities of millions. And there's a difference in the way people communicate, and that actually affects how they communicate things like risk. If you're in a small town, you might go have coffee at the diner and you're talking to, people before work, and you go, find out what's going on in town, and, you get your information, kind of horizontally, right? From other people in the community. If you're in a city, that doesn't really apply, and you might not have coffee with somebody, but they're from a different part of town, different borough, that they're at. So their experience may not be the same as yours. So you're getting your information more vertically from, something you've gotten from a newspaper or something you've seen on the computer. Now think about that in the tight cultures, usually the rural cultures, and southern cultures as well. You get your information horizontally. What has replaced, the diner? You think about it, it's Facebook. Facebook has replaced that. So you get your information from Facebook posts and from your friends, and you're going to, if you're in a tight culture, you're more likely to believe what is posted from your friends than something vertical, right? That's just what you've been used to. So it could be that what your friend's posting was something that they got from somebody else, and it's passed around, and it may not have any reliability at all. But the fact that it's coming from a friend in a tight culture, you're more likely to give that higher weight. So that's one of the issues with social amplification, and you see it in vaccination rates, here in the United States and other countries as well. Is where you have tighter cultures, their information that they share is going to be different. Now, what's interesting is the vaccination rates depend on the value of the country that they're in. So if I'm in an Asian country that has a tight culture, they may have a very high vaccination rate if that tightness of the culture, if the information being shared is actually to go get vaccinated, and they may even have higher risk that they're talking about related to people who have had COVID and sharing that information. So the tightness doesn't tell you if they're going to get vaccinated. It just tells you how the information is going to get shared. So hopefully get that published soon. I think one of the things we had to think about is how risk and social identity and how we get our information affects us. So people are social beings. We're social beings, and we are going to amplify, the information that we get, and it helps with our alliance when we share information. and it's one thing if we share information at the diner and, it's like, if you just sat there, think about that, and I know this may be a completely foreign concept for those of you who didn't grow up in small towns with diners and things like that. But if you just sat there the whole time and never contributed anything, people would think you're kind of weird, so you got to contribute something, right? You got to give up some info. And so it's kind of the same thing, except now the info you're giving up is, on a Facebook post. Yeah. Anyway, it's part of our social identity. And you certainly are have the potential of sharing misinformation and even running counter to, what your friends are saying. So you have people and one of the, places I lived in was Missouri. And I lived in small towns, and people actually get in disguises to go to the doctor to get vaccinated because in their community, that's not considered the thing to do, So, it's our social identity, also impacts, the way we perceive risk, The other thing that we also have is emotions related to the way we take in information. Here is this is an interesting experiment. They asked people to just look at a graphic, a chart, just to see if they could interpret a chart on restaurant profits, and the restaurant profits were like taco, pizza, hot dog, that kind of thing, and they could correctly interpret the graph. But when they got to adding graphs on controversial subjects that might have an emotional impact, all of a sudden people couldn't get that. They couldn't interpret it correctly. Now you can say, well, they were deliberately being stupid about it. Well, it turns out they were actually paying them to get the answer right. And so the reality is, when you encounter something that has a negative emotion, it floods over you, and you I'm sure most of us have experienced this at some point in our life, where our negative emotions affect our judgment, and the same thing can happen even in receiving information and how we interpret that information. So even if you're capable of interpreting it, you can have that kind of informational flooding, that emotional flooding, that affects your perception of the risk itself. And here's the ways that and here's different research on this topic, but the ways that we deal with this, we can do some additional analysis of the problem solving, but that's not the most common way that people deal with information that gives them a negative emotion. Most common ways is avoidance and denial. The information that I just saw was wrong, or we reframe it. If we saw something that oh yeah, well, but everything gives us cancer, so don't worry about it. Or a very common way, this is we have something called confirmation bias. We go out and what do? We seek information that supports our opinion that is contrary to the information we see, in order to reduce the negative emotion. And so if I see information about my cigarettes causing cancer, I say, yeah, my grandpa smoked cigarettes and lived to be 95. So we go find some other facts to contradict something that we're seeing as giving us negative emotions. Here was one with just the real flooding with water that people had. People who had previously experienced flooding will use emotional coping strategies to reduce negative feelings about seeing information about potential flooding. So you would think, going back to that, the COVID thing, that direct experience would have an impact on your, how you perceive the risk. Well, it turns out, when they see information now after they've had the flooding, that they'll go out of their way to try to deal with it, the emotion of it, and not the information that they're getting. So the first thing they want to do is just reduce the emotional impact. And one of the ways, they'll pick one of these mechanisms, coping mechanisms for getting away from the negative part of it. So you think, people who've had flooding would have, more likelihood, maybe, of getting that risk right. Turns out they don't, because they look for coping strategies to deal with the negative emotion that they get from receiving information about it. I think one of the things I'd like to point out here, though, can be very easy to be arrogant about our position that we take, and that we know more, and that we've got the right information, and that, and then we're smarter. This is actually in front of the, I don't know if you know where this is, if you're local here, the BCPA, Bloomington Center for Performing Arts. And there's the statues out there, and it has several quotes from Abraham Lincoln. This is from a speech that he gave here. Really like this. And he was talking about something very different in terms of viewpoints. We think about, how emotional it is that people have in their differences in COVID and vaccinations and climate change and those kinds of autism and that type of thing. Abraham Lincoln was talking about slavery and perceptions of slavery. He says, if we were situated as they are, we should act and feel as they do. And if they were situated as we are, they should act and feel as we do. So we ought never lose sight of that fact. And I think that's, a very humbling thing is, if you'd gotten the same information, maybe if you'd grown up in the same way of other people who have an opposing point of view to your own, there's a high likelihood you would believe what they believe, and they would believe what you believe. And I think that's an important part, of kind of understanding, this too, is having the humility to say, doesn't mean that there's not an objective right, and there's not an objective truth. What it is saying, though, is you may be experiencing this because of the way that you grew up or the information that you got. So, all right. So to conclude, we have optimism bias that kicks in, and I think that especially, is true in things like heart disease, and things that are not so dreadful, and things that happen over a period of time. And when there's dread involved, we tend to over-assess the likelihood of the risk. We look for confirmation to confirm our own, biases, because it reduces the negative emotion that we have. We don't like things that we can't control, so we overestimate the risks of things we can't control. And social amplification has affected, misinformation and the perception of risk in the last few years. So those are kind of the things that we have to think about. I'm going to leave this with you. As I think Heather had mentioned, I'm on the ethics committee both here locally and on the I'm the vice chair of the National Ethics Committee. And although I won't be presenting it, I think that this is going to be the topic that you'll have in March, is what is our ethical responsibility as professionals to understand and share accurate information. So when we get information, how do we assess that? Do we assess it accurately, and do we share information, or do we just, grab it and say, okay, I'm going to share this, and because I like that, and somebody else has to come up with the contrary part of this because this is the part that I like. So what is our obligation as a professional? So anyway, all right. So, and I see my colleague Chris. Of course, Chris is going to have a question. Do we have time for questions, or were you?
Yeah, we are coming really close to time, but Chris, if you want to ask your question here of Jim quickly, we can move that through.
Well, I really just want to comment, if I may, that I studied statistics in Simpson's Paradox, but I never paid much attention to it until I saw a very interesting article by a professor at Columbia University, Xavier Sala and Martin, who pointed out that in the period roughly from 2002 until 2006, there was this unusual thing that just about every country in the world had economic growth, which was rare in history because countries grow at different rates at different circumstances. But in that period, basically economic growth everywhere. And in that period, that paper pointed out that income inequality in the world declined. And income inequality in just about every single economy in the world increased. And that's, to me, that was such an extreme thing. But the very unusual thing about this period, 2002, 2006 roughly, was that the fastest growing economies in the world were also the economies with the largest population. Very fast economic growth in China and India. And this is similar to the phenomenon here, that the populations that have the highest rates of vaccination are also the populations with the highest risk of COVID, because that was public policy emphasis. We wanted to vaccinate people with the highest risk first. So the result is that we observed this strange situation. 300 million Chinese people getting out of extreme poverty into relative middle class, that's a huge change in the scale of the population of the world. And if you take China and India together, changing in such a way, that's a very unusual situation. And if you look at the later periods and the more recent periods, the country that has the last 25 years, the fastest economic growth in the world, from what I understand, is Botswana. Almost nobody pays attention that there was this dramatic change, improvement in Botswana, because it's a small country with small population, but they recently got ahead of South Africa in terms of their standard of living, and that used to be the country that was maybe the poorest in the world. So that's just what came to my mind.
Thanks, Chris. That's a great example of how these large these large numbers can swamp the overall aggregates, and so you got to make sure that you're comparing apples and apples. These things, and look for those bright spots. Togo is another one that's had good growth, and people don't think about Togo as being a country to model or anything like that. So anyway, Great comment. Thanks. All right. Heather, I guess we're out of time, right?
Yeah, it looks like we are, Jim, but I do have a couple of quick announcements for everybody. Just wanted to run through for everybody who's still hanging with us right now. Do totally appreciate this conversation today, Jim, and I know we could probably talk for hours about this particular topic. So really great information and takeaways from today. Wanted to share with everyone, and I hope you're seeing my screen right now, the CPCU Society has recently done a huge update to their website. If you have not had a chance to get out there and take a look at that yet, please do. There's great information about there, but also highly suggest that everyone go out and check out the CPCU Society's online community, which is their Interact community. You can find great information here, and a lot of you found out about this particular chapter meeting for the Central Illinois chapter right here in Interact. That's because we published it so that everyone could attend and learn about this great information. If you have not joined the Interact community, highly suggest that you do. Has a lot of connection to other CPCUs out there and can provide you the latest and greatest that's going on, not just in our own chapter, but in all the other chapters, as well as CPCU Society events too. One of those events that is coming up here pretty quickly in the next few weeks, the interest groups of the CPCU Society took on the challenge last year of doing these roadshow style events. This is an open event. anyone can attend. You do not have to be a CPCU Society member. We want to make sure that everybody can kind of peek behind the curtain of what happens in the CPCU Society and get them interested. So maybe they can look at joining now that there are different options for membership. And just a quick reminder to everybody as well, if you have not renewed your membership with the CPCU Society, get in there, join and renew now. But this upcoming roadshow actually is featuring one of our chapter members. You see here Scott Homa is part of our chapter, and he will be part of this great panel discussion about effective documentation of your policy files. So definitely encourage everyone to get out there on the Interact community, check out everything that is new and ongoing on the CPCU Society site. And also wanted to give a huge shout out. Our former CPCU Society president, our past president, Sharon Coaches, joined us today. And next year's CPCU Society president, Brett Clausen, is on the line too. And just a huge shout out to the two of them for joining us today. We do appreciate your engagement with our chapter. And with that, we thank you all for your time and appreciate everyone coming. This meeting was recorded, so we will be posting it on our chapter YouTube account and include that in some of your upcoming communications. Thanks, everyone.